When did you begin your first serious study of birds? Serious in the sense as a field research.
Well, it was mildly serious when I was in Burma. But of course, I hadn't had my zoology background then. I acquired that later on when I came to Bombay. While we were in Burma, I came to Bombay for 1 year to attend a commercial college and at the same time do my academic zoology.
Who interested you most in zoology?
Father Blatter. He was the one who really forced me to take this course. He said that you will never get anywhere with your bird study unless you have a good scientific background, a zoological background. So he got me into St. Xavier's College, and there we had a wonderful teacher, Professor Mullan, who whole generations of students have been through. And he was very good and took a lot of trouble, and I learned a lot from him. And he was always, up to the end of his life, he was a great friend.
And when did the idea of writing a book as such, a book on birds, when did it come to you?
Well, this was a plan that had been simmering for a long time. The Bombay Natural History Society, before 1923, had published a series of charts, bird charts for schools. And the idea was that when these charts were exhausted, they would use the same blocks, the color blocks, for bringing out a book. And I was asked to write this book.
One of the founders of the Bombay Natural History Society had been EHA,
Yes.
Edward Hamilton Aitken. Did you meet him ever? Did you have a chance to meet him?
Not consciously. I must have seen him at the meetings of the society. But then I was a boy at that time, so people don't usually pay much attention to boys, especially Indian boys in those days, because most of the people were British.
But he was a marvelous writer.
Yes, he was very good. But I was very happy to hear that he also, if you read his articles, they feel as if he's written effortlessly, just flown like this. But I believe he had to take a lot of trouble in cutting and changing and polishing and honing and so on. And that is why and I think that's a very good practice. I have found it very useful because every time you read what you have written, you always think of something, some improvement in it, and in the long run, it is, because I feel that things of this sort, if they are to go down with people, they should be enjoyable to read, at least pleasant reading. If it is just bare facts stated, then nobody is interested in that. And I am very gratified to find that many of the reviews always stress on this point, that these books, apart from being history of birds, are readable, and so that gives me great pleasure.
Your 10-volume book, that is the handbook of birds of India and Pakistan, in which quite a lot of details have been given about the bird life, the description, bird lore, and plumage types, and feeding, breeding, etc. Now, you must have written it species by species. Now, as far as the plumage and other things are concerned, you could always have reference works.
Yeah.
But the most important thing, which some of us have seen, is your description of the habits of the birds. Now, how did you refer to your diaries, or did you write
Yes.
from?
I used to keep a notebook with me whenever I went out in the collecting birds and so on. And I noted down all their behavior and so on the spot, and also their calls. And I think it's fatal not to write down the calls at once, because in about 10 minutes by the time you get to your camp, you have forgotten the details of that. So the thing is to write down immediately while you are hearing the thing. Of course, this written calls really don't mean anything. But if you have once heard the bird before, and then when you see it written down, it comes back to you at once. But
one of the places that you used to visit, or you still do, is Kihim across the harbour. How were you going there?
well, the same way as you can do now by ferry boat. There has been no improvement whatsoever in the travel. It takes, in fact, in those days, there were some really first-class launches with comfortable seating, and there was a first class in it, and now they're all gone, and you have these which are crowded till they sometimes sink, as they have done.
The co-author of your handbook was Professor Dylan Ripley. How did you meet him, and how did he come into your life?
About during the war, he was a postgraduate student at
Yale University.
No, Yale he joined later on but in one of those universities, either Harvard or somewhere. And during the war he had joined the army. So he was posted somewhere in Ceylon. And the headquarters was at Delhi. So every now and again he had to go and report to the Supreme Commander, whatever they called it. And on his way to Delhi from Ceylon, he always used to break journey here and come and see me at the museum. And so we got talking, we made plans about what we should do after the war, and when things were easier, when transport was available, and petrol and so on.
Are you interested in like motor cars or motorcycles?
Motorcycle was a passion of mine.
When did you acquire your first motorcycle, and what was it?
Well, long before I acquired one, I used to ride friends' motor bicycles, and I think rather they were not happy at my taking it apart and putting it back and so on. But that's how I spent my holidays at that time. And after that I had several motorcycles, but the last one on which I did the tour of Europe was a Sunbeam.
What about the car that you had soon after your marriage?
Yes, when we were living at Baikal, then that is the time I had the little Austin 7. That was also a wonderful car. I don't know why they don't, with a little refinement, I think it could be the ideal car for a town like Bombay.
What was the mileage it was giving?
Oh, the mileage was about 45 miles to a gallon. And the price of petrol was 11 annas a gallon. Not a liter, but a gallon, which is 4.5 liters, is it?
Yes.
Yes. So 11 annas. And then one trip to Pune that we did, we went for black buck shooting. And we did a lot of running around in places, and not only driving up to Pune, but then going around. And the whole expense came to about, I think it was less than 150 rupees.
Mm-hmm. Including the cartridges and the food?
Yes, got the food and everything included. That's unbelievable, really, nowadays. And it is this work that I have been able to do, which I may tell you that I took it up as a thing of self-defense, because there were no jobs available. And so I got my friend Prater, who was the curator of the society, to write to these various states, various Indian states like Hyderabad and Travancore and Cochin and so on. And because no work had been done there. And I said if they would provide the expenses, then I don't want any salary, but I would like to do this work. And the things were so cheap in those days that I could manage, and I had plenty of time. I was not pressed for time where you need a jeep or something to rush up and down and back again to your... So we could go on for months together and do the thing thoroughly.
Most of the surveys you talked about, Hyderabad, Kerala, that's Travancore and Cochin in those days, Sindh, Bahawalpur, and Orissa and Bastar. Was your wife with you also all along?
In most of these things. And in some places it was really tough work. I mean, one wouldn't expect a woman to put up with it so cheerfully.
And who were the people who were working along with you at that time? Some of the younger or the older people who came along. For example, Minor Sagan. When did he...
No, Minor Sagan was when he was going to Afghanistan. He wanted very much to go to Afghanistan, to work in Afghanistan. So he asked Whistler whether he knew anybody who would go with him. So Whistler wrote to me. And
Whistler is the policeman.
Yes, he was also one of our best ornithologists at the time. Of course, there were no Indians in the line at that time, and all the work in the past has been done by Britishers. And some of them have done excellent work, and now it is easy for us to build on that.
Yes.
But
how was your life with Colonel Minor Sagan in Afghanistan?
well, he was a very sort of contradictory character. He was an exceedingly nice man, but he could be absolutely brutally cruel, and also he was a bully. He was a born bully and a great upholder of the British Raj. So that anything you said against the British, he simply got wild and yes, but otherwise he was a very good naturalist, and a man who had no sentiment. For instance, in the war, he was in Tanganyika, and he was in the army when the war was going on in Tanganyika. It was a German territory, they took it over, and he found 2 officers, and he asked them to stop and surrender. So they started running. So he chased them, and with his knapkerry he knocked their brains out. Just like that. And absolutely, when people said, oh, this is not right, he said, why? We are in the war, we are expected to kill our enemy. What does it matter if I shoot him, or I cut his throat, or I knock him?
During all your trips, you must have written meticulous field diaries.
I didn't write any narrative diaries, except once or twice once when I was in Tibet. I did that. But I usually had some friends with me, like Lo Kuan Tho, who was a very meticulous diarist. And I have been able to use, all his diaries have come to me. And I have been able to use a great deal of that in my autobiography. And
How did you travel to Tibet? Did you go across the Nepal Himalayas or to Sikkim?
No, from Almora, that is the shortest and the pilgrim route, because the highest pass you have to cross on the way to enter Tibet is about 16,500. Whereas there are a number of other passes which are much higher, and at that time we went, they were all snowbound, and this was the only one which was available. So we went that way.
What did you see there? The most Tibetan birds, the nesting birds, and
yes, I really wanted to see many of the birds. For instance, the bar-headed goose and some of these birds that come here in the winter, but we never see them breeding. I wanted to study their breeding habits and their habitat in their winter quarters, in their summer quarters, and so on. So
in Pali Hill of now, you had mentioned that there was a bird, the painted stork had come. How did it get about there?
Well, this was really a pond among huts. But one morning we suddenly found a painted stork there, and never again or before. But how it got there and why, we don't know.
Sometime during 1930s or 40s, you went to Dehradun.
Yes. We after I had finished some of these surveys, there was nowhere to stay when I was in Bombay, and maneuvering with the different states for support and so on. It took several months. So we went and stayed in Dehradun. Actually, I had a great fascination for the Himalayas from the time I was a small boy. And my brother Hamid had retired and he was settled in Mussoorie. So he said, why don't you come and live in Dehradun, which was a very good decision, because Dehradun is just at the base of the hills, and we could spend some time with him, and we had very good friends in Dehradun. So altogether, and there was, of course, the Forest Research Institute and other institutes which were very helpful to me in my work. I was writing up some report of some survey at that time.
Is that the time when you met or had contact with Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who was in the jail?
That was one of the times when he was in jail in Dehradun. The thing was that the superintendent of the jail was my landlord in Dehradun. So he used to, when he visited the jail and so on, he must have mentioned to Nehru that I was staying there and all that. So he used to bring messages from there, and I used to, he sent me he asked me to get, I don't remember whether he sent a copy or he asked me to send him an autographed copy of this bird book to send to his daughter, Indira Gandhi, who was also very keen on birds, and at one time she was, I think, the president of the Delhi Bird Watching Society also. So he wanted to give this book to her as a birthday present, and that is what Mr. Gandhi has mentioned in various places, that I never knew how much I was missing till I got this book and I learned about birds and got interested.
One of the major work done in India as a part of the Bombay Natural History Society's research work, and which was initiated mainly by you and then carried on thereafter, is the bird migration studies. Now, bird migration is you ring the bird and release them, and how did this thing start in this country?
Well, actually, the Maharaja of Dhar in 1926, somebody, I think the British Museum people must have asked him or what, I don't know. But he asked the Bombay Natural History Society to supply him with some rings for putting on to ducks to study the migration. Because this is a fairly, it was new at that time. Even in European countries, there was not very much of it being done. So this Maharaja, of course, no rings were available in India. So we had to, the Bombay Natural History Society had to manufacture these rings, like the Rolls-Royce engines, by hand, and cut the strips of aluminium and polish them so that the edges didn't hurt the birds and so on, and stamp them with the inscription, Inform Maharaja Dhar, at that time. But we had no dies for that, but we had individual dies, A, B, C, D, and so on. So you had to, and each ring took about an hour or so to do, so we couldn't really produce very many. But the few rings that we supplied to him, he had ducks and coots caught in his state, and he put them on, and we got a very surprisingly large number of recoveries from that. And that really gave us an idea to do it on a larger scale, and that a lot of information about movements of birds could be got from it. But it was an expensive business to have special people who would go around and spend months there at various places and get the birds caught and ringed and so on. So we couldn't afford it at that time. But in about 1959, a certain virus disease suddenly appeared in a forest in Mysore, and the Virus Research Center in Pune, they found that it was a disease, it was a virus that was spread by ticks. And some of the ticks apparently had traveled from Siberia on the birds, because they were the same species as found in Western Siberia, and they were not found in between. So the logical conclusion was that they may have come by. So the World Health Organization took up this matter and asked the Bombay Natural History Society. They asked me to go there and discuss this matter with them. And they were very keen to they asked whether we had any information about bird migration. I said, we have not done any work of this kind, and because we had no finances. So they put up some finances, and they said, you better start off this, because we are very keen to have ticks collected from birds, migratory birds. And that is how we started off. In the beginning, we used to devote a lot of time in collecting ticks from birds. Now these ticks, this disease that had appeared is known as the Kayasanur forest disease, because an area known as Kayasanur forest occurs in Karnataka. And the thing is that these ticks, after they have gorged themselves, they drop off. And when the jungle people go down collecting firewood or whatever it is, they get onto them and they bite them, transferring the virus to them and also to monkeys. So the most important birds for this work were the ground feeding birds, which were liable to be to carry these sticks which dropped off. And so we started it on a fairly large scale in 1959-60. And We have been financed by various international bodies since then.
Your other association with the Bombay Natural History Society has been apart from being the president now, and then you are the honorary secretary at one time, you were also a guide for university for the PhD.
Well, that thing started very late. It started in, when was it, 1958 or 59. That was because as I said, I had the same trouble when I wanted to specialize in birds after doing my work in academic zoology. There was no university in India who was capable of giving the training. So then I approached the University of Bombay, and there was a very responsive vice chancellor at that time. And I had this thing introduced where the society was recognized as a guide for field ornithology.
What gave you the most satisfaction in your life in the various work you have done and the campaigns you have done for conservation and conservation of species, habitats?
Well, I have had great satisfaction in all the work in the field that I have done, all the expeditions and so on. And looking around me, I think there are very few people who have had such a happy life, in that their profession has been their hobby. And I think it is only under those conditions that you can get the best out of yourself, when you are enjoying the work you are doing. And this conservation, as I said, I was a very keen hunter, but in course of time I discovered that game was getting less and less, and that there was more and more killing and more destruction of habitats, and forests were disappearing and so on. So I said we must now stop killing and take to conservation. And that was how it started. Of course, the Bombay Natural History Society had been carrying on this campaign for many years before. And most of the wildlife protection legislation that exists owes basically to Bombay Natural History Society or some of its influential members.
What would you advocate for the conservation in the present day context?
Well, I think that the conservation idea that is sold to the young people today, to the children and so on, is entirely on the wrong lines, because it is more sentimental oriented, whereas this should not be so at all. And they are taught that it's a sort of crime to shoot an animal and all that kind of thing. I think that's just hypocrisy, because we get our animals killed in the slaughterhouses and so on. And the idea of conservation is really that we should try and build up the population of animals up to a stage where they begin to produce interest. If you consider them as capital, then a stage will be reached when there will be more animals than the area can support, in which case they will be susceptible to diseases and to undernourishment, and they will die. So if you have a surplus lot, I think it's a criminal in a country like ours, which is always squealing for food and proteins, not to make use of the extra. What is the preservation for?
Yes.
So that after a certain stage, it would be the right thing to cull it and reap the harvest. Otherwise, it's not a sentimental operation. But
what would you like to leave as a legacy for the future generation, in way of an institution or in way of a future?
Yes, I think that the Center of Ornithology,
Yes,
which is the goal of the Bombay Natural History Society, towards which we are working, if it comes into operation, that will give me a very, very great satisfaction, because I have striven for it all my life, and sort of I can I can certainly, I think, justly take the credit for having created an awareness about birds in India, because when I was young and there were none of these books available, there was no interest at all. And that is why we are still so backward in the scientific study of ornithology. And I hope that this institute, if it comes up, will make up for lost time.